Greetings, cozy knights. Lower your swords and rest by the fire. Tonight, we trace the complete story of Serana, the vampire who slept through the fall and rise of empires. A woman sealed away in stone long before Skyrim had a name, waking to a world that forgot she ever existed, and a family whose love broke her as much as it protected her. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what games you want me to cover next, and subscribe if this helps you sleep. A coffin in the dark. It begins with silence, and silence is not a small thing to say about a place like Dim Hollow Crypt. The mountains east of Moth keep their secrets well, tucked behind a worn trail that skirts the cliffs near the shrine of Mehrunes Dagon, and for centuries almost nobody had reason to walk that path. Then the vigilance of Stendar started paying attention to it, and paying attention to Dim Hollow Crypt turned out to be a fatal habit. Word had reached the Order that vampires were combing through the ruin looking for something, and one of their own, a man named Brother Adelvold, had grown convinced that whatever they wanted was worth understanding. His curiosity, and the curiosity of his colleagues, would end in blood. Not long after, the vampires escalated dramatically. They didn't just skulk around Dim Hollow anymore. They marched on the Hall of the Vigilant itself, the Order's headquarters in Skyrim, and they burned it to the ground, killing the keeper of the hall and nearly every vigilant inside. Only a scattered few survived the massacre, and one of them, a priest named Tolan, carried the truth of what happened directly to the newly reformed Dawn Guard, an ancient order of vampire hunters that had been dormant for generations and was only now stirring back to life under the leadership of a hard, humorless man named Isran. When the player character first walks into Isran's makeshift fortress, the story doesn't waste time. Isran wants soldiers, not tourists, and he has already decided that the fastest way to understand what the vampires are after is to go looking himself. Except he can't be everywhere at once, so the job falls to whoever just walked through his door. Tolan, still grieving his slaughtered brothers and sisters, insists on coming along despite Isran's open skepticism about whether the Vigilants have the stomach for this kind of fight. It's a small human moment before the real horror starts. Two men bickering about competence while a much larger tragedy waits up the mountain. Tolan gets his wish and travels ahead, and when the player finally reaches Dim Hollow Crypt themselves, they find him already dead, killed by vampires who didn't wait for reinforcements. This is one of those details that a player can walk right past if they're rushing through the dungeon. But if you slow down and actually look, his body is right there near the entrance, silent proof that the danger inside was not exaggerated. Dim Hollow Crypt itself unfolds as a place built in layers, a narrow tunnel giving way to an underground river, waterfalls catching torchlight, ancient Nordic stonework overlapping with older, stranger architecture that doesn't quite belong to any single era of the crypt's construction. Deeper in, the player encounters vampires locked in combat with Draugr, an unusual sight that hints at just how old and how contested this ground actually is. There's a balcony overlooking a wide cavern where, if you simply pause and listen rather than charge forward, you can overhear a chilling exchange between the vampire Lokil and Vigilant Adelvold, the same scholar whose curiosity started all this. Adelvold is being interrogated, and he dies rather than give up whatever secret he was protecting, but not before his notes are left behind for whoever comes looking. Killing Lokil and the vampires around him clears the way to the deepest chamber of the crypt, a puzzle room built specifically to guard whatever waits at its center. A pedestal draws blood from your hand to activate it, and a ring of braziers must be shifted into alignment, Purple fire and trace lines glowing across the stone floor until the pattern finally connects. When it does, the ground itself seems to answer. A great stone sarcophagus rises out of the floor. Inside is a woman, not a corpse, not a construct, not a monster in the shape of a person, but an actual living, breathing figure who has clearly been sealed away for an unfathomable stretch of time. She stumbles out disoriented, blinking against light she hasn't seen in centuries, and the first thing she does is size up whoever just freed her. She can tell immediately whether the person standing in front of her is a vampire or not, which is itself a small clue about the kind of senses she has and the kind of world she comes from. She introduces herself simply. Her name is Serana. She is carrying an Elder Scroll strapped to her back, an object so rare and so mysterious that entire orders of scholars devote their lives to understanding even a fraction of what it contains. And she is asking a total stranger to escort her home. She doesn't explain much beyond that at first. She's guarded, understandably, given that she has just woken up after who knows how long to find an armed stranger standing over her tomb. When pressed about how long she's actually been down here, her answer is unsettling in its vagueness. She doesn't know exactly, only that it's clearly been far longer than anyone intended. Long enough that she has to ask, with genuine confusion, whether Cyrodiil is now the seat of an empire. A question that only makes sense if you understand just how much time has quietly slipped past her while she slept. Before ever reaching that final chamber, the crypt tests its visitors in smaller, quieter ways too. Scattered throughout its winding passages are hints that Dim Hollow was never simply a crypt in the ordinary sense, but something closer to a vault, layered with Draugr sarcophagi from an entirely separate and older tradition of Nordic burial. Chests hidden behind honeycomb tunnels, frostbite spider colonies that had clearly been left undisturbed for generations before any of this began. There's a particular kind of dread that builds simply from noticing how many different eras of construction seem to overlap inside this one mountain, as though whoever originally built it kept getting added onto by later hands, who had no idea what already lay beneath their feet. A puzzle room guards the descent into the deepest chamber. Silver torch sconces embedded in the floor that must be pushed into specific positions until each one ignites with unnatural purple fire. An old and deliberate design meant to keep out anyone who wasn't determined enough or worthy enough to solve it. And throughout all of it, a distinct and unique musical theme plays, one found nowhere else in the game. A small detail that composer and design choices alike seem to have reserved specifically for this one location, as if even the game's own soundtrack understood that whatever waited at the bottom of this crypt deserved to feel different from every other dungeon a player might wander into on an ordinary afternoon. The vigilance of Stendarr, the order whose destruction set this entire chain of events into motion, deserve a moment of their own context here, since their fate is what actually gives Dim Hollow Crypt its weight before Serana ever enters the picture. Founded generations earlier in the aftermath of a great and terrible crisis that had once threatened all of Tamriel, the Order dedicated itself to hunting down exactly the kind of supernatural threats that ordinary soldiers and city guards were never equipped to handle, vampires chief among them. Their headquarters, the Hall of the Vigilant, stood as a symbol of that mission for years, and its destruction, along with the death of its leader, a woman known as Keeper Karset, represented a loss the Order might never fully recover from. What makes this detail sting even more, once you understand the wider timeline, is how narrow the window of her existence in the story actually is. She and her vigilance can be encountered briefly before the attack occurs, dedicated and confident, entirely unaware that their annihilation is only days away. A piece of dramatic irony the game never draws attention to directly, but leaves quietly present for anyone who happens to visit early enough to notice it. Adelwald and Tolan were simply two of the last remaining voices of that once proud order, and their deaths inside Dim Hollow Crypt marked the effective end of an institution that had stood for generations, snuffed out almost entirely because a handful of vampires wanted to keep one long-buried secret from ever seeing daylight again. The word wall discovered in the crypt's final amphitheater, carved with the shout for draining vitality, only deepens the sense that this location had significance stretching back long before any vampire vigilant or dragonborn ever set foot inside it. Ancient even by the standards of a land where ancient ruins are hardly rare. The escape from the crypt is its own trial. Gargoyles that had been nothing more than stone statues moments before come to life and attack as you cross a narrow bridge. Animated guardians that had presumably stood sentry over Serana's prison for as long as she'd been sealed inside it. Beyond them, more skeletons rise from the floor, and Draga burst from coffins along the walls, the crypt seemingly determined to make sure that whatever had been sleeping here stays buried. A word wall waits in the amphitheater beyond that gate, a word of power tied to draining vitality, carved into stone that predates almost everything currently living in Skyrim. Fighting through all of it with Serana at your side, watching her navigate the same halls that were, for her, essentially a birthplace, sets a strange tone for the entire relationship that follows. She's a stranger, and yet she's also in this specific dungeon, more at home than anyone else could possibly be. Once you finally emerge into daylight, the true scope of the story is still entirely hidden. All you know is that a Moth priest destroyed an order of vigilant monks, that a young woman was hidden away with an ancient and dangerous artifact, and that she wants to go home. It will take a great deal of unraveling before anyone understands why her mother thought a stone coffin, sealed for possibly thousands of years, was safer for her than the world outside. The woman who slept through an empire. Serana asks to be taken to her family home, a place called Castle Volkihar, and even hearing the name for the first time carries weight, spoken the way someone might say the name of a childhood house they were never quite sure they wanted to see again. She is cautious about revealing too much on the road there, evasive when questioned, unwilling to share her inventory or wander too far from your side. Behavior that reads less like arrogance and more like the wariness of someone who has learned the hard way that trust is expensive. She'll answer a few careful questions if you ask, admitting that she's been imprisoned for what she calls a very long time. And if you push further, she reveals that her imprisonment predates the rise of the First Empire of Cyrodiil, which places her sleep at somewhere around 4,200 years before the current moment in Skyrim's history. An almost incomprehensible span for anyone but her to actually process. Castle Volkihar sits on an isolated island off the giant's coast of Hafengar, cloaked in mist so persistent that sailors along Skyrim's northwestern shore have long whispered that the place is cursed. More legend than location, if it even exists at all outside of ghost stories. The castle predates even the vampires who currently occupy it. Long before it belonged to the Volkihar bloodline, the ruins suggest it once served an entirely different purpose, home to what may have been an Aedric cult, evidenced by a broken statue of Mara still standing somewhere in its abandoned wings, and by the name given to one section of the structure, referred to in old records as the Tower Chapel of Dibella. Whoever built this place originally worshipped something entirely unrelated to the darkness that eventually claimed it. By the time Serana leads you across the bridge toward its gates, that older history has been buried under generations, possibly millennia, of Volkihar occupation, and the watchman standing guard barely blinks at the sight of her, recognizing her on sight despite the staggering length of her absence, which tells you something quietly disturbing about how long vampires actually live and how slowly time seems to move for beings who have effectively stepped outside of it. Inside, Lord Harkon is waiting, and the reunion between father and daughter is not warm. He is fixated far more on the Elder Scroll strapped to her back than on the fact that his daughter has just returned to him after an absence spanning multiple historical eras. His interest in you, the stranger who brought her home, only goes so far as whether you might be useful, and he extends an offer of his own vampiric blood, a chance to become a vampire lord like himself, framed as a reward for your service. Refusing that offer, siding instead with the newly reforming Dawn Guard, sets the entire rest of the story on his path, and it earns you Harkon's open hostility and banishment from the castle. What's fascinating, and what the game lets you discover slowly rather than all at once, is that Serana herself doesn't seem fully at ease here either. This is supposed to be home, and yet something about the atmosphere, the way her father speaks to her, the absence of anyone she'd call a friend, suggests a homecoming that doesn't quite fit the word. Within a matter of days, she makes her own choice, leaving the castle to track you down at Fort Dawnguard instead, walking away from the family she just spent centuries separated from in order to align herself with the very organization built to destroy vampires like her. The exact scale of her imprisonment is something even scholars of Skyrim's lore have argued over for years, and it's worth sitting with the ambiguity rather than resolving it too neatly. Serana's own comments, taken together, point toward an age that predates the middle of the First Era, since she seems entirely unaware that the Dwemer, the deep elves whose vanished cities still dot the underground of Skyrim, no longer exist at all, and the Dwemer disappeared roughly 3,700 years before the events unfolding in this very story. Some accounts place her sealing even earlier still, somewhere in the depths of the Merethic era, before recorded history in Tamriel had properly settled into anything resembling a fixed calendar at all. What all of these estimates agree on, regardless of which exact figure you land on, is that Serana is almost certainly one of the oldest living, thinking beings anyone in Skyrim will ever have the chance to actually speak with, rivaling entities as ancient as the dragons themselves. And yet she moves through the world with the curiosity of someone experiencing it fresh, rather than the jaded weariness you might expect from something that old, that contradiction, ancient beyond calculation, and yet perpetually encountering the world for what amounts to the first time in her own conscious memory, is part of what makes her such a compelling companion to travel beside. The court that Serana walks back into at Castle Volkihar is worth understanding in its own right, since it's populated by figures whose loyalty to Harkon is anything but simple devotion. Vingalmo and Ortholf, two of the highest-ranking vampires in the keep, have spent what appears to be a considerable stretch of time locked in quiet rivalry with one another, each maneuvering for greater standing and influence within the court, each apparently hoping that whatever comes next in Harkon's grand design might elevate his own position above the others. Other members of the court, figures like Ferren Sadri, Hestler, and Fura Bloodmouth, fill out the day-to-day life of the keep as traders and trainers the Dragonborn can deal with directly, each of them slotted into a role that suggests this castle functions as something closer to an actual functioning society than a simple lair of monsters. None of them, notably, seem to know the full shape of what Harkon is planning, at least not at the level of detail Serana herself possesses, which means her return home isn't just uncomfortable because of her father's fixation on the scroll she carries. It's uncomfortable because she can see, more clearly than anyone else in that castle, exactly how much danger the entire court is being led toward, without their knowledge or consent. Bystanders in a scheme that could unmake the natural order of day and night across all of Nirn. If she chose to say nothing and simply resume her old place among them, she would be condemning an entire community of centuries-old beings to consequences none of them signed up for. That she instead chooses to walk away and expose the danger at considerable personal risk and against the family that raised her says something important about the values she managed to hold on to even after everything she'd been through. Isran is furious when she shows up, unwilling to extend an ounce of trust to a member of the species he has dedicated his life to exterminating, and he only tolerates her presence at all because of your involvement. It is at Fort Dawnguard, in this uneasy and tense arrangement, that Serana finally starts explaining herself properly. She tells you plainly that her father is not, in her own words, a good person, and that whatever plan he's chasing is dangerous enough that she needed to escape her own home to stop it. This is where her personality actually starts to surface, beyond the guarded stranger from the crypt. She is defensive when questioned about her own vampirism, uncomfortable discussing the actual ceremony that turned her, treating it as something closer to degrading than empowering. And yet, she doesn't seem to regret the power itself. Her only real regret, the one thing she circles back to again and again in conversation, is what that transformation did to her family. She had, by her own account, a fairly lonely childhood, even before any of this happened, isolated in that castle with only her parents and the servants for company, filling the silence by teaching herself everything she could about the land of Skyrim from books, and learning alchemy and the properties of plants from her mother in the castle gardens. There's a particular kind of sadness in that detail. A child who built her entire understanding of a world she would eventually be locked away from using nothing but pages and second-hand knowledge. She's also, despite all of this, surprisingly playful when the mood allows for it, dry and observant, willing to poke fun at herself and at you in equal measure. Traveling with her through Nordic ruins, she'll comment on how gullible the Drago used to be back when she was younger, casually referencing a first-hand memory of an era most players will never fully wrap their heads around. She interacts with the world in small human ways too, sitting in chairs, chopping firewood, reading books she finds lying around, even dancing or clapping along with bards in taverns, little behaviors that make her feel less like a plot device and more like an actual person who happens to carry an unbelievable weight of history behind her eyes. She has, by this point in the story, no interest in temples, and if you eventually work up the nerve to propose marriage to her while wearing an amulet of Mara, she'll turn you down every single time, gently but firmly, citing an unease around temples that traces back to something in her past she isn't ready to fully unpack yet. It's a small refusal that hints at a much larger wound, one that the story will eventually circle back around to explain in full once you've earned enough of her trust to hear it. A king who feared death. To understand why any of this happened, you have to go back long before Dim Hollow Crypt, long before the Volkihar clan even existed in the shape it holds today. Before Harkon became a creature of the night, he ruled as a king, and by every account that survives, his domain was vast and his power was real, the kind of authority that most rulers only dream about. But power, no matter how absolute, has never once solved the problem of mortality, and as the years wore on and death crept steadily closer, Harkon found himself consumed by a fear he could not out-legislate or out-fight. This is, in some ways, the oldest story there is. A man who has everything except more time, and who becomes willing to trade almost anything to get it. What he found was a bargain with Molag the Daedric prince most closely associated with domination, corruption, and the enslavement of mortals, a being whose entire nature revolves around twisting freedom into servitude. The price of that bargain was steep even by Daedric standards. Harkon sacrificed 1,000 innocent souls to seal the deal, a number so staggering that it's worth sitting with for a moment rather than letting it pass as a simple piece of lore trivia. 1,000 people, presumably many of them his own subjects, given over to purchase eternity for himself and his bloodline. In exchange, Molag transformed Harkon into what is now called a vampire lord, a form of vampirism far older, far purer, and far more powerful than the disease-based strain that spreads through Skyrim's more common bloodsuckers. This was not an infection passed carelessly from bite to bite. This was a ritual, deliberate and ceremonial, and it did not stop with Harkon alone. His wife Valerica and his daughter Serana were also offered up to Molag on the day of his summoning, as tradition apparently demanded of them, and the ceremony they underwent to receive the same gift, or the same curse depending entirely on how you choose to look at it, was one that few who attempted it were known to survive. Serana herself is deeply uncomfortable discussing the specifics of what that ceremony actually involved, and the game is careful never to spell it out explicitly, leaving it in a space that's unsettling precisely because it's left to the listener's imagination rather than described outright. What is confirmed is that both Valerica and Serana emerged from it alive and transformed, and that this specific circumstance, being made a vampire directly by Molag himself through this ritual rather than through disease, earned them both a particular and honoured title within vampire society. They became known as Daughters of Cold Harbour, an incredibly rare distinction, since Cold Harbour is the name of Molag plane of oblivion, and being called his daughter in this context marks a woman as one of the purest-blooded vampires in existence, tied directly to the source of vampirism itself, rather than descended several bytes removed from it. This detail matters enormously to the story that follows, because it means Serana's blood isn't just special in a narrative sense, it's special in a literal, mechanical sense within the world's own internal logic. Pure vampire blood that traces directly back to Molag own gift, rather than through the diluted transmission of ordinary vampirism, carries a kind of potency that ordinary vampires simply do not possess. And that potency, as we'll come to see, is precisely what makes Serana so valuable to certain schemes far beyond her control, and precisely why her own mother would eventually go to such extraordinary lengths to keep her hidden. The transformation changed Harkon and Valerica both, but not in the same direction. Where you might expect a shared trauma to bring a married couple closer together, in this case, it did the opposite. Power, once you actually possess it in this kind of unlimited, undying form, has a way of revealing exactly who someone already was underneath the trappings of mortality, and both Harkon and Valerica became, in their own telling, drunk on what they now had. It marks, according to what fragments of the story survive in journals, dialogue, and Serana's own recollections, the exact point where their marriage began its long, slow collapse. Harkon threw himself into questions of power and dominance. increasingly obsessed with what his new immortality could accomplish if he pushed it further, while Valerica, watching him change, began to harden into someone far more suspicious and far more willing to work against him in the shadows. Neither of them, it seems, ever stopped to consider what any of this was doing to the daughter caught in the middle of it, the one person in the family who hadn't asked for immortality, who hadn't sought power, who was simply present when her parents made a choice that would ripple across centuries and eventually cost her everything resembling a normal existence. There is one more detail worth sitting with here. Something Serana reveals, if you're patient enough to draw it out of her over the course of your travels together. Even as a vampire granted immense and unnatural power, she does not describe her transformation with anything like triumph. She calls the ceremony itself degrading, a word she doesn't use lightly and doesn't elaborate on further, leaving exactly what happened to her imagination and speculation, rather than explicit confirmation, which, based on what limited context exists in her dialogue, seems to be precisely the point. Whatever was demanded of a child or a young woman, being offered up to a Daedric prince known specifically for domination, was not something dignified or heroic. It was, by every implication the game leaves scattered in her own words, something she survived rather than something she chose, even if the outcome left her more powerful than almost anyone she would ever meet. The specific powers that came with that transformation are worth understanding in their own right, since they shape so much of how Serana moves through the world for the remainder of this story. As a pure-blooded vampire, her senses operate on a scale that ordinary mortals, and even ordinary disease-born vampires, simply cannot match. Her hearing is sharp enough to register sounds most creatures would never notice, closer to something like echolocation than conventional listening. Her vision cuts through darkness effortlessly, though it comes bundled with an equally heightened sensitivity to sunlight, a curse and a gift welded permanently together. Her body heals faster than any mortal wound should allow, and her blood no longer needs to be warmed by a beating heart in any conventional sense, sustained instead by the hunger that defines her condition. None of this, notably, is something she treats as a burden when discussed in isolation. It is the context surrounding how she got these abilities and what it cost her family to grant them that colors every conversation about her own nature with a complexity that never fully resolves into either regret or pride. It is also worth remembering that this entire family tragedy could have taken a very different shape if Harkon had simply been willing to grow old and die like everyone else who ever ruled anything across the whole of Tamriel's long and largely forgotten history. Fear of mortality is, in its own way, one of the oldest and most universal human impulses there is, and Harkon's specific response to that fear, trading not only his own soul but the autonomy of his wife and daughter as well, reads less like a singular act of villainy and more like an ordinary fear taken to its most extreme and least forgivable conclusion. He wanted more time, and he was willing to spend other people's futures to purchase it for himself, a transaction that would echo forward through centuries of consequence that he himself would spend the rest of his unnaturally extended life failing to fully understand. The distinction between what Harkon became and what an ordinary vampire looks like elsewhere in Skyrim is a detail worth dwelling on, since it explains a great deal about why he views most of his own subjects with such open contempt. The vast majority of vampires encountered across Skyrim contracted their condition the ordinary way, through disease, a bite or an infected wound passed from an already turned vampire to a mortal victim, weakening over time until the transformation takes hold completely. Harkon considers these vampires half-breeds, an insult he applies without hesitation even to members of his own court who have served him loyally for centuries, because in his mind, and by every implication the law gives us, there is a categorical difference between vampirism received second-hand, through infection, and vampirism granted directly by Molag Bal's own hand, through ritual sacrifice. His transformation into what's known as a vampire lord grants him a true, monstrous second form entirely distinct from the human passing appearance most vampires maintain day to day. A form with sweeping wings, elongated claws, and a face that abandons any pretense of humanity altogether. This is the shape he takes when the final confrontation eventually arrives, and it's a shape that exists specifically because his transformation was never a disease to begin with. It was a covenant, sealed in blood and sacrifice, and the power it granted him reflects the severity of what he paid to receive it. Understanding that distinction makes his disdain for his own followers less like simple arrogance and more like a genuine, if deeply unpleasant, acknowledgement of a real and measurable difference in the nature of what each of them actually is. The house that broke itself. If you strip away the vampirism and the prophecy and the Elder Scrolls entirely, what's left underneath Serana's story is something achingly ordinary, a portrait of a family that was already fracturing long before any Daedric bargain made things unfixable. She describes her early years, even before becoming a vampire, as isolated in a way that had nothing to do with immortality. Her parents were simply busy, consumed by the responsibilities and pressures of ruling, and the castle, however grand it might have looked from the outside, offered little in the way of companionship for a child growing up inside it. She had no friends her own age. There were only her parents when they had time for her, and the servants who lived and worked within the castle walls, background figures rather than confidants. It's the kind of loneliness that doesn't announce itself dramatically, the quiet, everyday sort that simply becomes the water a person swims in without ever really noticing it as unusual, because they have nothing else to compare it against. She filled that isolation the way many lonely, intelligent children do, by turning to books. Her account of her own upbringing paints a picture of someone who spent countless hours absorbing everything she could about the land she lived in, learning the geography, the history, the secrets of Skyrim itself, entirely second-hand, through pages rather than experience. It's a detail that becomes almost poignant once you know what happens to her later, because that same girl who read about the world instead of experiencing it firsthand would eventually be locked away from that world entirely for thousands of years, trading one kind of distance for another, far crueler one. The castle gardens offered her something a bit more tactile. This is where her mother actually did spend meaningful time with her, teaching her the properties of plants, the foundations of alchemy, and by extension, laying the groundwork for the darker magical education that would follow once Valerica began instructing her in necromancy as well, by the standards of vampire households, and Serana herself is careful to frame it this specific way. When discussing it, her relationship with her mother was as loving and as nurturing as circumstances allowed. That's a heavily qualified compliment, the kind of praise that acknowledges real affection, while also admitting that the conditions surrounding it were far from ideal. It is worth imagining for a moment what those years inside Castle Volkihar might actually have looked like from a child's perspective, long before any of the vampirism or prophecy entered the picture. A vast, echoing home, halls built for a ruler and his court rather than for the intimate warmth of a family. Servants moving quietly through rooms that a lonely daughter would eventually come to know better than the two people who were supposed to raise her. She speaks of teaching herself the geography and history of Skyrim through books rather than travel, an entire imagined relationship with a land she had never actually set foot upon, built instead out of pages and second-hand descriptions. There is something quietly devastating in realizing, decades later once you've walked the whole breadth of Skyrim alongside her, that the young woman who once dreamed about all of this from behind castle walls eventually got the chance to see it for herself. Only after losing thousands of years she can never reclaim in the process. Her relationship with her father followed an entirely different shape. Distant is the word she uses, and it's notable that even at her most guarded, and even at moments when she has every reason to resent him for what his ambitions eventually cost her, she never frames her childhood feelings toward him as hostile. She was never against him, not back then, not before the darkness that would eventually consume all of their lives together took hold. There's an important distinction buried in that detail. The rift that eventually forms between Serana and her father isn't something that existed from the start. It's something that grew, slowly and then all at once, out of choices Harkon made after his transformation. Choices that had nothing to do with the ordinary distance of a busy, powerful parent, and everything to do with an obsession that would eventually eclipse every other relationship in his life, including the one with his own daughter. Once Harkon, Valerica, and Serana were all transformed into vampires following the pact with Molag Bal, the family dynamic that had already been quietly strained by an absent, powerful father and a distant marriage didn't heal. It accelerated toward collapse. Power, as we've already discussed, revealed rather than repaired the cracks that were already there. Harkon's obsession with his own mortality had, ironically, simply been replaced by an obsession with a new kind of vulnerability, his susceptibility to the sun, a weakness that immortality had done nothing to solve and had, in some ways, made even more unbearable given everything he'd already sacrificed to escape death in the first place. For centuries, by every account, this vulnerability gnawed at him, until his search for an answer led him to an ancient prophecy, one he became so consumed by that it eventually became the single organizing obsession of his entire existence. The prophecy was called the Tyranny of the Sun, and what it promised, if fulfilled, was almost impossibly tempting to a man in Harkon's position. If enacted properly, it would allow vampires to walk freely under any sky, day or night, without fear of the sun's weakening effects, effectively removing the single greatest limitation that vampiric existence still carried. It's easy to see, from Harkon's perspective, why this became worth almost any price. He had already paid an enormous cost to escape mortality once. Completing this prophecy, in his mind, must have felt like finishing what he'd started, closing the one remaining gap between himself and true, unassailable power. But the prophecy demanded specific ingredients to work, ingredients that were not easy to gather, and among them, buried in the fine print of what this ritual actually required, was the blood of a daughter of Cold Harbor. His own wife or his own daughter would have to be sacrificed in some fashion to make his ambition real. This is the exact moment where Valerica's story diverges sharply from her husband's, and where the seeds of everything that follows, dim hollow crypt, the sealed sarcophagus, centuries of imprisonment, all of it, are actually planted. Valerica came to believe something that Harkon either couldn't see or refused to accept, that if this prophecy were fulfilled and eternal night truly fell across the land, it wouldn't liberate vampires so much as doom them. Too much attention, too much fear, too much organized human resistance would inevitably follow an event that dramatic. and rather than securing the future of their kind, she believed it would hasten their extinction. Whether she was right or wrong is a question the game never fully answers, and honestly, it's more interesting left unresolved. But what matters is that she believed it deeply enough to act on it, and acting on it meant working directly against her own husband in secret, using the one advantage she still had, which was knowledge he didn't yet possess about exactly what the prophecy required. The scroll and the sarcophagus. Valerica was, by every account that survives her, a formidably skilled woman even beyond her royal and vampiric status, a talented alchemist and a dedicated student of necromancy who had spent years of her long existence exploring the forbidden arts most people spend their entire lives avoiding out of simple fear. Hidden within the ruined portion of Castle Volkihar, she maintained a private laboratory, tucked away from the rest of the castle's activity, where she conducted her own summonings and experiments largely undisturbed. It was here, through years of dedicated and secretive research, that she made a discovery that would ultimately shape the rest of her daughter's existence. She uncovered the secrets of a place called the Soul Cairn, a realm of oblivion, where souls captured in black soul gems are ultimately sent once those gems are expended. And over the course of several decades of careful, patient work, she managed to construct an actual portal capable of taking her there. This wasn't idle curiosity. This was preparation, though it would take time before the full shape of her plan became clear even to the people closest to her. As Harkon's obsession with the tyranny of the sun deepened, and as he inched closer to understanding exactly what the prophecy required, Valerica realized the danger her family was actually in. He needed 3 Elder Scrolls, along with Oriel's bow and the blood of a daughter of Cold Harbor to complete the ritual. And while he was still assembling the pieces, still searching, still without full understanding of every requirement, Valerica made her move before he could finish connecting all the dots. In an act of open defiance against her own husband, she fled Castle Volkihar, taking with her 2 of the Elder Scrolls that contained crucial fragments of the prophecy's instructions, effectively stripping Harkon of resources he desperately needed and didn't yet have a way to replace. But taking the scrolls alone wouldn't have been enough. Harkon still had access to Serana, and Serana's blood alone, given her status as a daughter of Cold Harbor, was one of the 2 viable options for completing the ritual, meaning removing the scrolls only slowed him down. It didn't actually stop him. Valerica needed to remove the other essential piece of the equation entirely, and that meant separating her own daughter from the only home she'd ever known, hiding her somewhere so remote and so well protected that even centuries of dedicated searching wouldn't be able to find her. This is where Dim Hollow Crypt enters the story from an entirely different angle than the one the player experiences first. What feels, in the early hours of the Dawnguard questline, like a mysterious ancient ruin housing an unexplained artifact was, from Valerica's perspective, a carefully chosen sanctuary, a place remote and defended enough that she believed her daughter would be safe there, sealed inside a specially constructed sarcophagus, alongside one of the 2 stolen Elder Scrolls, protected by wards and puzzles and guardians specifically designed to keep anyone unworthy from ever reaching her. Whether Serana was actually consulted about this plan, whether she had any say whatsoever in becoming an unconscious prisoner for what would ultimately stretch across thousands of years, is a question the story leaves deliberately uncomfortable rather than clean. Based on what we know from Serana's own later confrontation with her mother, and based on the raw, unresolved bitterness she still carries about this exact decision, even after centuries have passed, It stands to reason that she was not given a meaningful choice in the matter, that her mother made this decision unilaterally and then acted on it, treating her own daughter as a piece to be protected rather than a person to be consulted. There is something deeply painful buried in that asymmetry. A mother who loved her daughter enough to sacrifice literally everything to protect her, and who simultaneously loved her in a way that stripped away any agency Serana might have had over her own fate. Once Serana was sealed away, Valerica completed the second half of her plan. She fled into the Soul Cairn herself, taking the other stolen Elder Scroll with her. Using the very portal she had spent decades secretly constructing to vanish into a realm of oblivion that even her husband, for all his power, could not easily follow her into. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how total this act of defiance actually was. Valerica didn't simply run and hide somewhere within Skyrim's borders, somewhere Harkon's vampires might eventually stumble across through diligent searching. She removed herself entirely from Nirn, choosing a form of self-imposed exile inside a plane of the afterlife itself, rather than risk her husband ever laying hands on the scroll she carried. When the Ideal Masters, the mysterious entities who govern and rule over the Soul Cairn, discovered an intruder in their domain, a fight broke out, and Valerica found herself effectively trapped there, negotiating an uneasy and precarious arrangement in exchange for continued refuge, an arrangement that would keep her imprisoned within the Soul Cairn for just as long as Serana remained imprisoned within Dim Hollow Crypt. Harkon's response to discovering this double betrayal, that his wife had fled with 2 Elder Scrolls and hidden away the one asset that could have completed his prophecy, was fury on a scale that matched the scope of everything he had already sacrificed to get this far. He commanded every vampire in his court to search for them, dispatching his followers across Skyrim and presumably beyond, in an effort to track down either his missing wife or his missing daughter, or ideally both. But Valerica had planned well, and the concealment held. None of his vampires managed to find either of them, and as centuries wore on without a single lead, without a single breakthrough after generation upon generation of searching, Harkon eventually did something that seems almost unthinkable given the scale of his ambition. He gave up hope of ever finding them. Not forgiveness, never forgiveness. The game is careful to specify that his memories of the betrayal remained sharp, and his resentment remained fully intact, promising that should he ever actually cross paths with either of them again, they would answer dearly for what they'd done. But the active searching stopped, worn down eventually by the sheer, grinding weight of centuries spent chasing ghosts. It is worth pausing on just how long that search actually lasted before Harkon finally allowed himself to abandon it. Centuries is the word used again and again in every account of this story, and centuries, for an immortal vampire lord commanding an entire court of loyal followers, means something very different than it would for an ordinary mortal ruler. Harkon had the time, the resources, and the sheer stubborn will to keep looking far longer than any mortal king ever could. And the fact that even he eventually ran out of patience says something significant about just how thoroughly Valerica had covered her tracks. She hadn't simply run and hoped for the best. She had built an actual sanctuary in a plane of oblivion that even a being as powerful and as furious as Harkon could not easily breach. And she had hidden her daughter behind wards, puzzles, and guardians specifically designed to repel anyone unworthy or unprepared. It's a testament to her skill as both an alchemist and a necromancer that this concealment held for as long as it did, though it's equally a testament to just how much of her own remaining life she poured into maintaining it. trapped the entire time behind a barrier of her own making, negotiating endlessly with entities who saw her only as a source of souls to extract, rather than a woman desperately trying to protect her only child. Understanding exactly how Valerica came to unlock the soul cairn's secrets in the first place requires understanding a piece of magical theory that runs throughout the wider world of this story: the mechanics of black soul gems. Ordinary soul gems, the kind used commonly by enchanters throughout Skyrim, are capable of capturing the souls of animals and creatures for use in enchanting equipment. But black soul gems are a different and far darker category of object entirely, capable of capturing the souls of sentient, thinking beings, an act considered a serious and often illegal transgression by most mortal societies. When a black soul gem is eventually used up, its captured soul doesn't simply vanish or dissipate. According to the very law Valerica spent years of her own solitary research uncovering, it travels instead to the soul cairn, joining the countless other lost and wandering souls who drift through that bone-pale realm without purpose or rest. Valerica's research into this exact mechanic, conducted patiently and secretly within her hidden laboratory tucked into the ruined wing of Castle Volkihar, is what eventually allowed her to construct a working portal into that realm at all. A feat of magical engineering that took, by her own account, several decades of sustained and careful effort before it was finally functional. It is a chilling thought that a woman capable of that level of arcane sophistication, someone who unlocks secrets about the fundamental structure of souls and the afterlife that most necromancers across all of Tamriel would never come close to touching, ultimately used that hard-won knowledge for nothing more ambitious than protecting her own child from a husband who had lost sight of what mattered. And so the family that had once ruled a kingdom together, that had once, however imperfectly, shared a home and a bloodline and a set of hopes for what immortality might offer them, scattered into three separate and isolated fates. Harkon remained in Castle Volkihar, nursing his fury and his obsession, still chasing a prophecy he now had no way of completing. Valerica remained trapped in the soul cairn, a prisoner of her own making, negotiating with entities who cared nothing for her family drama and everything for the souls they could extract from her in exchange for shelter. And Serana slept, entirely unconscious of any of this, sealed inside a sarcophagus in the mountains east of Moth, unaware that her mother had sacrificed her own freedom to protect her, unaware that her father had spent centuries hunting for her, unaware, most painfully of all, that the world outside her tomb was continuing on entirely without her, empires rising and falling, entire civilizations living and dying, while she remained frozen at the exact moment her mother made the choice to hide her away. Castle Volkihar itself, meanwhile, kept operating as though nothing catastrophic had happened, which is in some ways the saddest detail of all. Harkon retained his court, a collection of vampires who served him with varying degrees of loyalty and self-interest. Figures like Vingalmo and Ortjolf, who by all appearances spent much of that intervening span jockeying quietly for position and favor, waiting for whatever opportunity might eventually arise from Harkon's obsession, finally either succeeding or failing. Life inside the castle continued in its rhythms of feeding and feasting and idle centuries-long boredom. The mundane texture of immortal existence carrying on in a place that had, at its center, an empty throne beside Harkon's own, a wife's chair that nobody sat in and nobody dared remove, a silent monument to the exact moment his family fell apart. It is one thing to lose someone to death, where the world eventually adjusts around the absence. It is another thing entirely to lose someone to an unresolved betrayal, where the absence itself becomes a kind of ongoing wound that never has the chance to properly close, reopened every single day for as long as the castle continued standing and the centuries continued turning over without any resolution in sight. The castle itself carries a history far older than the Volkihar bloodline that eventually claimed it. And that older history seems to have left its mark on the family that grew up inside its walls in ways nobody in the story ever fully articulates. Long before it became a den of vampires, the structure appears to have served an entirely different purpose, tied to the worship of the Aedra, the divine beings honored across much of Tamriel before the vampires who eventually claimed it as their own. A broken statue of Mara, the goddess of love and compassion, still stands somewhere within the ruined and abandoned wings of the estate, and one particular section carries an old name referencing Dibella, the goddess of beauty and desire, suggesting the castle once functioned as a place of genuine reverence and community before it became a fortress for creatures who feed on the very people such gods were meant to protect. There is something almost cruelly ironic in a family as fractured and loveless as Harkon's raising a daughter inside walls originally built to honor love and compassion. The architecture itself standing as a kind of silent, unintentional rebuke to everything the household eventually became. Whether Serana ever fully grasped that irony as a child wandering those same abandoned halls is impossible to know, though it's easy to imagine a lonely girl finding some quiet comfort in a broken statue of a goddess whose entire domain was the very kindness so noticeably absent from her own home. Centuries beneath the mountain, there's something genuinely difficult to comprehend about the specific nature of Serana's imprisonment, something that separates it from a more conventional story of captivity. She wasn't held somewhere and forced to endure the passage of time consciously, counting days or years the way a prisoner in a dungeon cell might. She was, by every indication the game gives us, essentially unconscious for the entire duration of her sealing, which means that from her own subjective experience, almost no time passed at all. One moment she was being sealed into a sarcophagus by her mother's hand, likely frightened, likely confused, possibly even angry about a decision she may not have fully agreed to. The next moment, from her own perspective, a stranger's hand was completing a puzzle of braziers and purple flame, and she was stumbling awake into a world that had continued on entirely without her for a length of time so vast it defies easy comprehension. This creates a particular and unusual kind of grief, one that doesn't resemble ordinary loss. Serana didn't lose years the way someone recovering from a long illness might. Watching time pass slowly and painfully while trapped and aware. She lost them instantly, all at once, the moment she opened her eyes in dim hollow crypt and realized just how much distance separated the world she remembered from the world she now had to navigate. When she asks, with genuine and unguarded confusion, whether Cyrodiil is now the seat of an empire, it's not a rhetorical question. She genuinely doesn't know. Her internal map of the world, the geography and politics and power structures she understood and had learned to navigate as a young woman, is now catastrophically out of date, a relic from an era so distant that the empires she remembers may not even be remembered by anyone else still living. Once she and the Dragonborn make their way to Fort Dawnguard, following the tense first meeting with her father at Castle Volkihar, Serana finds herself in an environment that is, in its own way, just as isolating as her centuries of imprisonment, if considerably more awake. Isran despises her on principle, unwilling to extend trust to any vampire regardless of circumstance, and tolerates her presence only because the Dragonborn vouches for her. It's a strange kind of homecoming, arriving in a world you barely recognize only to be immediately distrusted by the very people you've chosen to align yourself against your own father. And yet, Serana chooses to stay, chooses to explain herself as best she can, admitting plainly that her father is not a good person and that something dangerous is brewing that requires outside help to stop. This decision, made so early and so decisively, tells you a great deal about who Serana actually is underneath the guarded exterior she wears around strangers. She has just woken up into an unfamiliar world, has just been reunited with a father who cares more about an artifact strapped to her back than about her well-being. And rather than retreating into the familiar comfort of her own bloodline, she deliberately chooses the harder, lonelier path of working against her own family to prevent whatever catastrophe Harkon is planning. There's a particular kind of courage buried in that choice that's easy to overlook amid everything else happening in this early stretch of the story. Serana has no allies of her own here. She has just left the only home she has ever known, however troubled that home actually was, to throw her lot in with a stranger and an organization founded specifically to hunt creatures like her. She cannot be entirely certain the Dragonborn will keep helping her once the immediate danger passes, cannot be certain Isran won't eventually decide she's more liability than asset and act accordingly, and cannot be certain that whatever plan she's building against her own father will actually succeed, rather than simply getting both of them killed. And yet, she commits to this path anyway, walking into genuine uncertainty, rather than retreating into the false comfort of a family she already knows is broken beyond easy repair. That willingness to risk everything on the strength of a stranger's word, rather than the false safety of familiar dysfunction, says something quietly remarkable about who she actually is underneath centuries of guardedness and loss. The rest of the Dawnguard roster fills out around Isran in ways that give the fort its own particular texture, and Serana's uneasy place within it becomes more vivid once you understand exactly who she's living alongside. Soreen Girard, a Breton with a deep fascination for Dwemer technology, spends her time crafting and refining the crossbows that give the Dawnguard its signature edge against creatures who would otherwise overwhelm ordinary weapons, while Gunmar, a hulking Nord who has spent years honing his own skill at hunting dangerous animals, brings a very different kind of strength to the fort, someone whose hatred of vampires runs nearly as deep as Isran's own. Durak and Kellan round out the group as capable fighters loyal to Isran's cause, Kellan in particular sharing Isran's own history as a former member of the Vigilance of Stendar, before the two men parted ways over differences in method, and none of them, save for the Dragonborn's direct vouching, have any particular reason to extend trust to a vampire wandering freely through their headquarters. It is a genuinely uncomfortable environment for Serana to occupy, surrounded daily by people whose entire purpose is the eradication of exactly what she is, and the fact that she stays anyway, enduring that discomfort in service of stopping her father, underscores just how seriously she takes the threat he actually poses. She isn't naive about the danger of her situation here. She simply judges it the lesser danger compared to letting the tyranny of the sun prophecy come to pass unopposed. It's worth remembering too that this decision doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from a mother's earlier decision, made centuries before Serana was even in a position to have an opinion about it. Valerica had already decided long before her daughter woke up that Harkon's ambitions were dangerous enough to justify permanent exile from her family. In a very real sense, when Serana chooses the Dawnguard, or chooses to work against her father even while nominally remaining loyal to the Volkihar clan, she is completing a decision her mother made on her behalf long ago. Except now she's making it with full awareness and full agency, which is a distinction that matters enormously to her, even if the outcome ends up looking similar either way. As the relationship between Serana and the Dragonborn deepens across these early quests, small details of her personality continue to surface in a way that rewards patience rather than demanding it all at once. She's sharp-tongued and observant, capable of dry humor even in the middle of dangerous situations, and there's a specific kind of relief in her voice whenever she encounters something that hasn't changed since her imprisonment, something recognizable in an otherwise unfamiliar world. She'll comment on Nordic ruins with something close to nostalgia, noting how old they seemed even when she was young, and there's an odd comfort in that observation, a reminder that some things in Skyrim have simply always been ancient, regardless of which century you happen to be standing in them. She's also deeply reluctant to discuss the actual ceremony that made her a vampire, deflecting or shutting down that particular line of questioning whenever it comes up too directly, though she's far more willing to discuss the aftermath, the way it fractured her family, the resentment she still carries toward the decisions her parents made without her input. What becomes increasingly clear during this stretch of the story is that Serana's journey isn't really about defeating her father, not fundamentally. It's about figuring out who she actually is, once she's finally been given the chance to make her own choices, after centuries of having those choices made entirely for her. First, by a father who saw her blood as a resource, then by a mother who saw her as something precious enough to hide away without asking permission first. Both of these were, in their own ways, expressions of love, or at least what her parents understood love to mean. But both of them also treated her as an object to be used or protected rather than a person to be consulted. And untangling that particular knot, learning to exist as someone with genuine agency after literal millennia, spent as someone else's asset or someone else's secret, becomes the quiet emotional engine driving everything that follows. The Dawnguard itself deserves a moment of attention here too, since Serana's decision to align herself with them carries more weight once you understand exactly what kind of organization she's choosing to trust. This isn't a brand new group formed in response to recent events. It's a revival of something ancient, an order of vampire hunters that had existed generations earlier before falling into dormancy. And Isran's entire project is one of resurrection as much as recruitment, gathering scattered specialists like Serene Jura and Gunmar in an effort to rebuild something that history had allowed to fade. There's a strange symmetry buried in this detail once you sit with it. Serana spent centuries asleep while the world moved on without her, and the organization she now chooses to align herself against her own bloodline is itself something recently woken from a long dormancy of its own, rebuilt piece by piece out of people willing to take up an old, half-forgotten cause. Neither the woman nor the order she now travels beside are quite what they once were, and both are, in their own separate ways, trying to figure out what it means to exist meaningfully in a present that neither of them was fully prepared for. The Moth Priest's Price. The Elder Scroll strapped to Serana's back is, on its own, an object of almost unfathomable rarity and power, and simply possessing one does very little good if nobody can actually read it. Neither Serana nor the Dragonborn have any ability to decipher what the scroll actually contains, and Isran, for all his practical skill at organizing a vampire hunting operation, has no answers here either. The solution comes in the form of an obscure fact that Serana happens to know, that the Moth priests, a specialized order based out of the White Gold Tower in Cyrodiil, spend years of dedicated preparation learning how to safely read these ancient artifacts. Unfortunately, as Isran points out, the White Gold Tower sits half a continent away, which would make consulting one an impossibly long errand under normal circumstances. Fortune, or perhaps something less random than fortune, intervenes. Isran happens to have noticed an Imperial scholar recently passing through Skyrim, someone who might plausibly be exactly the kind of Moth priest they need, though he isn't willing to spare any of his own limited manpower chasing down a lead this thin. The search that follows leads to the discovery that this traveling priest, a man named Dexion Evicus, has already been captured, ambushed on the road, and taken prisoner by vampires operating out of a place called Forebear's Holdout. The vampire responsible, an orc named Malchus, isn't simply holding Dexion for ransom or convenience. He's actively working to enthrall him, breaking down his mental defenses through sustained magical pressure in an attempt to bend him into an unwilling servant. The confrontation that follows, defeating Malchus and severing his hold over the priest's mind, gives Dexion back his own will, though the process leaves him disoriented enough that he initially attacks his own rescuers before fully understanding that the vampire's control over him has been broken. Once freed and calmed, Dexion proves to be a font of exactly the kind of specialized knowledge the situation demands. He spent decades of his life devoted to the study of the Elder Scrolls, and even he admits that despite all that dedicated scholarship, the scrolls remain a profound mystery, even to those closest to understanding them. Nobody, according to his own account, truly knows where they came from or who originally wrote them. What is understood is that certain rare individuals are born with the specific gift needed to actually read one, an ability that allows them to glimpse fragments of past and future contained within the scroll's pages, though this gift comes at a steep and permanent cost. Reading an Elder Scroll over time drives the reader blind, a truth that Dexion will soon come to understand far more intimately than he'd like. He agrees to help, traveling back to Fort Dawnguard to perform the reading, and initially the ritual seems to work exactly as hoped. He deciphers a fragment of prophecy, glimpsing an image of a great and powerful bow, which he identifies immediately as Oriel's bow, a weapon of immense significance tied directly to the snow elves and their patron deity. But the vision comes at a cost that becomes apparent almost immediately afterward. The scroll he read was Serana's own, and reading it without adequate preparation has cost Dexion his sight permanently. He is now completely blind, unable to assist with reading any further scrolls, even though the investigation has already revealed that 2 more are needed to fully understand the prophecy Harkon is chasing. One concerning the interactions between dragons and the history of Nirn, and another said to foreshadow the defiance of gods through the blood of mortals, a detail whose relevance becomes chillingly clear the more of this story comes together. Retrieving those additional scrolls sends the story down 2 separate and demanding paths, one leading deep into Blackreach to recover the dragon scroll from the Tower of Mazark, and another leading directly into the Soul Cairn itself, since it is there and only there that the second scroll can be found, still in the possession of the very woman who fled there centuries earlier to protect it. But even once both additional scrolls are secured, Dexion's blindness means he cannot personally complete the reading that the situation demands. Instead, he offers an alternative, an ancient technique once used by the original Moth priests before the tradition of his order fully formalized into what it eventually became. scattered secretly across Tamriel, exist hidden locations known as Ancestor Glades, and Dexion believes one such glade exists somewhere within the pine forests south of Skyrim, near Volkihar. The glade itself, once located east of a small camp near Volkihar, turns out to be a place of genuine and startling beauty, a hidden clearing so unexpected after the difficult climb required to reach it, that even Serana, who by this point has seen a great deal of Skyrim's wilderness, reacts with open astonishment at the sight of it. At the center of the glade sits a specific ceremonial tool, a draw knife resting on a stone at the heart of a small stream, an implement traditionally used by Moth priests in this exact ritual, though few of them, as Dexion notes, ever actually get the opportunity to perform it themselves. Using the draw knife on a nearby canticle tree produces bark with a very specific magical property, one capable of attracting swarms of ancestor moths, delicate winged creatures whose connection to ancient magic is precisely what allows a moth priest to safely decipher an Elder Scroll's contents in the first place. Gathering 7 separate swarms of these moths, and then stepping into a column of light that forms at the center of the glade once enough of them have gathered, allows the ritual to finally activate. What follows is a vision unlike anything else in the entire questline. A glowing map spreading out with rivers traced in light, and 2 distant landmarks glowing with particular significance, revealing at last the specific location of Oriel's bow, hidden away in a place called Darkfall Cave in the far northwestern reaches of Skyrim. The ancestor moths do their work exactly as promised, protecting the reader's eyesight where Dexion's own preparation had failed him, and the prophecy at last becomes legible in full. It requires the Elder Scrolls, it requires Oriel's bow, and it requires the blood of a daughter of Cold Harbor, spilled directly onto that bough, in order to corrupt its power and turn what was once a weapon of the sun into an instrument capable of extinguishing it entirely. The rescue of Dexion Evicus, easy to treat as a simple side objective in the middle of a much larger quest, actually reveals a fair amount about how far Harkon's reach and ambition extend beyond his own castle walls. Malchus, the orc vampire holding Dexion captive at Forebear's Holdout, wasn't simply an opportunistic bandit who happened to stumble across a wandering priest. His deliberate, patient effort to break Dexion's mind and bend him into a fully enthralled servant suggests a level of coordination and purpose that points back toward Harkon's wider search for anyone capable of reading an Elder Scroll, meaning the vampires scattered across Skyrim weren't acting purely on their own initiative. They were, in effect, an extended network with a shared goal, even in locations far removed from Castle Volkihar itself. Dexion's own account of his life before this capture adds useful context too. He describes himself as a moth priest of the White Gold Tower, an institution whose lower floors house the Imperial Council, while the middle floors belong entirely to the Order of Moth Priests. A detail that quietly reinforces just how intertwined the reading of Elder Scrolls has always been with the highest levels of imperial governance and scholarship. The tower itself, he mentions, still bears damage from the recent war against the Aldmeri Dominion, a small aside that ties this entire vampire prophecy plot back into the wider political turmoil gripping all of Tamriel during this same period. The Great War's scars visible even in institutions as removed from open combat as an order of scroll-reading priests. Dexion's gratitude toward his rescuers and his willingness to travel all the way to Fort Dawnguard despite having no prior stake in the conflict between vampires and vampire hunters becomes his own small act of choosing a side in a war he never asked to be part of, not unlike Serana's own decision, made only a short while before him. There's something almost philosophically unsettling buried in the entire premise of the Elder Scrolls that this quest brushes up against without ever fully resolving, and it's worth lingering on before moving forward. Nobody, not even the most devoted scholars who spend their whole lives studying them, actually understands where these objects came from or who first wrote them. They exist somehow both inside and outside the normal flow of cause and effect, capable of showing fragments of the past and future to those with the rare gift to perceive them. And that gift always, without exception, comes bundled with the price of eventual blindness. Dexion Evicus paid that price in a single reading, sacrificing his eyesight permanently just to glimpse the shape of a bow he would never see with his own physical eyes again. It's a small, almost throwaway detail in the middle of a much larger story about vampires and prophecy, but it says something important about the nature of the forces this entire quest keeps brushing up against. Knowledge in this world is never free. Every insight into the deeper workings of fate comes at a cost measured directly against the body of whoever dares to look too closely. And Dexion's blindness is simply the most visible example of a rule that governs everything from Elder Scrolls to Daedric Pax alike. A mother behind the barrier. Long before the Ancestor Glade or Dexion Evicus ever entered the story, the search for the second Elder Scroll had already carried Serana and the Dragonborn back to Castle Volkihar. This time not to confront Harkon directly, but to search his own courtyard for clues her mother might have left behind. Serana suspects, correctly as it turns out, that Valerica may have concealed information somewhere within the ruined grounds she once called home, and using a secret entrance known only to family, the two of them slip into the castle's abandoned tower without ever needing to face Harkon's court directly. What they find inside is Valerica's old study, untouched for centuries, still holding the scattered remnants of a life interrupted mid-motion. Buried within a bookcase is Valerica's own journal, and reading it reveals both the location of her hidden laboratory and detailed instructions for the specific ingredients needed to open a portal directly into the soul cairn. The same portal Valerica herself constructed and used to disappear all those centuries ago. Assembling the required components, finely ground bone meal, fragments of soul gems, and purified void salts, each stored carefully in silver bowls scattered throughout the ruined laboratory, and combining them with a portion of Serana's own blood, finally opens the portal her mother once used to vanish from the world entirely. Stepping through it requires a particular sacrifice, since the soul cairn exists specifically as a destination for the dead, or at least the dying, and anyone hoping to enter without already carrying that connection must either become a vampire lord themselves or allow Serana to partially soul trap them, an option that comes with its own lingering weakness for as long as the traveller remains inside that realm. Navigating the soul cairn itself is no small undertaking, and the realm's sheer scale becomes apparent almost immediately upon arrival. It sprawls out in a way that has left even experienced travellers thoroughly lost more than once, its horizons stretching further than any single landmark can fully orient a visitor. And it's here that a separate discovery becomes relevant, since the skeletal remains of a spectral horse named Arvak can be found scattered somewhere within this same bone-coloured expanse. Reassembling his bones and reciting the proper incantation over them grants the Dragonborn the ability to summon him at will. A ghostly steed capable of galloping across ground and even open air alike, which turns out to be one of the only truly reliable ways to cover the cairn's punishing distances efficiently. The realm is dotted with towers and ruins that don't belong to any architecture familiar from the rest of Skyrim. Structures built by beings whose motives remain only partially understood, even by those who have spent considerable time studying this place. It is, in every sense, a landscape built for the dead, which makes the presence of two very alive, very determined travelers making their way through it feel like a quiet act of trespass against the natural order of the realm itself. Among the wandering figures scattered throughout this desolate landscape is a soul named Jube, whose own presence here carries a story entirely separate from Serana's family drama, and yet thematically tied to the same ideas of imprisonment and searching for release. His fragmented account, pieced together in fragments across the cairn, speaks to just how many souls exist here without any connection whatsoever to the Volkihar bloodline schemes. Ordinary people and adventurers from ages past who simply had the misfortune of being captured within a black soul gem at the moment of their death, left to wander this bone-white wasteland indefinitely, with no hope of ever properly passing on. Encountering him, and encountering the scattered pages of writing he leaves behind throughout the realm, adds a layer of somber weight to the entire journey, a reminder that Valerica's imprisonment here, however cruel and however long, is at least a controlled and comprehensible fate compared to the aimless drifting suffered by countless other souls trapped in this same realm, through no fault or choice of their own. The three boneyard keepers guarding Valerica's prison, meanwhile, are themselves formidable undead sentinels, positioned in separate towers scattered far apart across the cairn's expanse, specifically to make freeing her a genuine trial, rather than a simple formality, forcing Serana and the Dragonborn to cover enormous distances across this hostile realm before earning the right to finally break the barrier keeping mother and daughter apart. The Soul Cairn itself is a landscape unlike anything else encountered across the whole of Skyrim, a realm of oblivion built from bone-white terrain and drifting, wandering souls, entities who were themselves once captured within black soul gems before those gems were finally spent. These souls drift aimlessly through the wasteland, confused and lost, offering fragments of conversation to travelers passing through, a haunting reminder of exactly what fate awaits anyone unfortunate enough to be trapped here permanently rather than merely visiting. Following the path toward a massive ruin known as the Boneyard, Serana and the Dragonborn finally locate Valerica, standing near the entrance behind what turns out to be an invisible but very real barrier, a prison of her own making, born from an earlier conflict with the ideal masters who govern this entire realm. The reunion between mother and daughter carries an emotional charge that's hard to overstate, given everything that led to this exact moment. Valerica is initially stunned to see Serana at all, calling out her name with disbelief before quickly shifting her attention to the stranger who accompanied her daughter here. Wary and suspicious of motives she has no reason yet to trust. Once Serana vouches for the Dragonborn, Valerica finally begins to explain the fuller shape of what happened all those centuries ago, confirming what has been pieced together gradually across the whole investigation. She still possesses the second Elder Scroll, kept safe in her own custody this entire time, but she remains trapped behind the barrier separating her from the rest of the Soul Cairn, a consequence of her original conflict with the Ideal Masters when she first arrived seeking refuge. To free her, 3 Boneyard Keepers scattered across separate towers throughout the cairn must be defeated, each one guarding a piece of whatever magical lock keeps Valerica confined. Once all 3 keepers fall, the barrier finally drops, and Valerica leads the way into the Boneyard proper, only for the dragon Durnavir to appear almost immediately, summoning waves of skeletal bonemen to fight alongside him. This is not a small skirmish. Durnavir is an ancient and formidable undead dragon, and defeating him requires the combined effort of Serana, Valerica, and the Dragonborn working together. A rare moment of genuine cooperation within a family that has spent centuries defined almost entirely by fracture and betrayal. Once he finally falls, the Elder Scroll is recovered from a hidden alcove where Valerica had kept it safe all this time. And stepping outside the boneyard afterward brings an unexpected epilogue. Durnavir, rather than staying dead, rematerializes atop a nearby stone arch, offering a shout that will allow the Dragonborn to summon him back to Tamriel whenever needed. A small gesture of respect between two beings who understand, in their own very different ways, what it means to be bound to something far larger than themselves. But the true emotional core of this entire sequence lies not in the dragon fight, but in the conversation that happens around it, the long overdue and clearly overdue reckoning between Serana and her mother. Based on what we know from the tone and content of their exchange, Valerica's decision to hide Serana away without her consent has left a wound that hasn't healed simply because centuries have passed. Serana confronts her mother directly, and in doing so, forces Valerica to reckon with something she may never have fully considered before, that in her effort to protect her daughter from becoming a pawn in Harkon's scheme, she instead made her a pawn in an entirely different one, her own, without ever stopping to ask whether Serana wanted to be protected in that specific, life-altering way. It's a confrontation that doesn't fully resolve, not neatly, not in a single conversation, but it does seem to shift something in Valerica's understanding of what she actually did all those years ago. An uncomfortable but necessary recognition that good intentions and genuine love do not automatically excuse the harm caused by unilateral decisions made on someone else's behalf. What emerges from this reunion is a mother and daughter relationship that remains complicated and unresolved, but at least honest for the first time in longer than either of them can properly measure. Valerica cares for her daughter. That much has never actually been in question. But the particular shape her care took, protective to the point of erasing Serana's own agency entirely, mirrors in a strange and uncomfortable way the very possessiveness that defines Harkon's relationship to his daughter's blood. Neither parent, it seems, ever fully saw Serana as a person with her own right to choose her own fate. One saw her as a resource to be spent, the other as a treasure to be hidden, and Serana, caught for centuries between these two forms of ownership disguised as love, is only now, in this exact moment inside the soul cairn, beginning to reclaim some version of agency that was stripped from her long before she was even old enough to understand what was being taken. The ideal masters, the entities who preside over the soul cairn, and who trapped Valerica behind that barrier in the first place, add another layer of unsettling context to everything happening in this realm. Valerica had originally hoped to strike a bargain with them upon her arrival, offering something in exchange for sanctuary, and what they demanded in return was souls, an arrangement that reveals just how transactional and cold this particular corner of oblivion actually is. There is no warmth here, no mercy, only exchange. And Valerica's centuries of imprisonment behind that barrier stand as proof of exactly what happens when a negotiation with beings like the ideal masters goes even slightly wrong. It's worth sitting with the fact that Valerica, a woman powerful enough to construct her own working portal into another plane of oblivion entirely through her own solitary research, still found herself outmatched and imprisoned the moment she actually arrived there. a humbling detail that underscores just how far beyond ordinary vampiric power these ancient custodians of lost souls actually operate. Wandering further through this bone-pale landscape, wayward souls drift past without malice, former people reduced to lost fragments, murmuring about how lost and how horrible this place is to anyone willing to listen. A wandering chorus of exactly what awaits any soul unlucky enough to end its story, trapped inside a black soul gem rather than passing on properly. It's against this backdrop, this quiet and constant reminder of what oblivion actually costs, that Serana finally gets to say the things to her mother that centuries of separation never gave her the chance to say. The Vale. That time forgot, with both Elder Scrolls finally read and the location of Auriel's bow revealed, the path forward leads toward Darkfall Cave, tucked into the far northwestern reaches of Skyrim, near the orc stronghold of Morkazga. The cave itself proves treacherous even before the true destination comes into view. A fast-moving underground river eventually sweeping travelers along whether they're prepared for it or not, depositing them, battered and soaked, into a cavern populated by frostbite spiders, and deeper still, the frozen remains of long-dead pilgrims who clearly never completed whatever journey they originally set out on. Beyond Darkfall Cave and the narrow passage that follows lies something genuinely unexpected, an entire isolated region called the Forgotten Vale, hidden away for so long that its very existence has slipped out of common knowledge entirely. This valley was once the spiritual heart of the Snow Elves, an ancient people whose worship centered on a deity known as Auriel, understood by other cultures across Tamriel under different names, including Akatosh among men. Thousands of years before the current era, this Vale functioned as the nexus of an entire religious tradition, home to way shrines, temples, and a great chantry dedicated to their god. What remains of it now is haunting rather than grand, populated by the corrupted, degenerated remnants of the Snow Elves themselves, the farmer, twisted by centuries of enslavement and subterranean existence into something almost unrecognizable compared to what their ancestors once were. Frost trolls, ice wraiths, and giant frostbite spiders now claim territory that once belonged to pilgrims and priests. The former themselves deserve a moment of attention here, since their presence throughout this entire vale is its own quiet tragedy layered beneath the larger, one unfolding around Verther and his brother. These creatures were not always the blind, feral, chitin-armored monsters that now infest the Vale's every cave and tunnel. They were once the Snow Elves themselves, the very same people who built the way shrines and the great chantry, before centuries of enslavement, mutilation, and forced subterranean existence twisted them into something almost unrecognizable as descendants of the same civilization. Encountering them throughout the Forgotten Vale and understanding what they actually once were adds a layer of quiet horror to every fight, a reminder that entire peoples can be erased not through sudden violence alone, but through the slow, patient cruelty of generations spent in darkness. Beyond the central path leading toward Verther's throne, the Forgotten Vale hides several secrets that reward travelers willing to step off the beaten trail. And two of them are worth understanding for what they add to this story's sense of scale. Hidden platforms scattered throughout the Vale respond to specific paragons, colored crystals that unlock passage to isolated pockets of the valley otherwise sealed off from the rest of the region, one leading to a quiet forested clearing and another to a secluded river valley, each guarded by its own dangers and its own rewards, including Auriel's shield, a companion piece to the bow itself, held by a particularly well-armed Falmer deep within one of these hidden groves, and soaring above the frozen lake at the Vale's heart are two ancient dragons, Naslarum and Voslarum, drawn to this isolated region for reasons the game leaves largely unexplained, beyond the simple fact that the Vale's remoteness has apparently made it an appealing refuge for more than one kind of ancient and powerful creature over the centuries. Their presence overhead as Serana and the Dragonborn make their pilgrimage between way shrines adds an additional layer of danger to an already perilous journey, a reminder that this hidden valley, however sacred it once was to a vanished people, has since become a refuge for exactly the kind of forces that thrive in places the rest of the world has simply forgotten to look. Waiting near the entrance to this frozen, forgotten world is one of the last two uncorrupted snow elves left in existence, a figure named Knight Paladin Gelibor, who has spent an unfathomable stretch of his own long life alone, guarding the way shrines and refusing to abandon his post, even after everyone he once served alongside is long since dead or transformed into something monstrous. His brother, he explains, is named Verther, once the Arch-Curate, who led the entire chantry of Auriel, and Gelibor believes, based on incomplete and outdated information, that Verther may still be alive somewhere deeper within the Vale, possibly held captive by the Falmer who now overrun the sacred grounds he once presided over. He asks for help reaching his brother, framing the entire quest as a rescue mission, a chance to finally save the one member of his own family he has any hope of recovering after so many centuries of loss. The path to reach Verther is itself an elaborate pilgrimage, requiring travelers to visit 5 separate way shrines scattered throughout the Vale, filling a ceremonial vessel called the Initiate's Ewer at each one, before finally pouring its contents into a receptacle before a great statue of Auriel, unlocking the doors to the inner sanctum, where Verther is believed to be waiting. Along the way, the Vale reveals itself in fragments, frozen skeletons of long-dead snow elves scattered throughout the caves, remnants of a civilization that clearly ended in tragedy long before anyone currently living was born, and the ever-present threat of the corrupted Falmer, who seem to have claimed every corner of this once sacred ground as their own. What awaits inside the inner sanctum is not the rescue Gelibor hoped for. Verther is alive, seated on a throne within the ruins of the great chapel, but he is no rescued captive. He is instead a vampire, and has been for far longer than anyone realized, infected at some point after being forsaken by Auriel himself, an abandonment that left him bitter enough to construct an entire prophecy purely out of spite toward the god who turned away from him. This, it turns out, is the actual origin of the tyranny of the sun, not some ancient vampire scheme cooked up by Harkon's bloodline at all, but the calculated revenge of a snow elf who wanted nothing more than to corrupt Auriel's own influence over the world as payback for being abandoned in his moment of need. Verther allied himself with the very Falmer, who overran his own chantry, using them to eliminate what remained of his order and seizing control of the sacred grounds so that he could quietly wait, for however many centuries it took, for the exact combination of circumstances that would let him finish what he started. That combination of circumstances, as it turns out, is standing directly in front of him, because Gelibor, without ever realizing it, has unwittingly delivered exactly what his brother needed all along. Verther explains it himself once the confrontation begins, revealing that all he ever required to corrupt Auriel's bow was the blood of a vampire and the bow itself, and that a pure vampire, a true daughter of Cold Harbor like Serana, is precisely the missing ingredient his prophecy demanded from the very beginning. Serana's reaction to this revelation lands with genuine weight, the realization dawning on her in real time that this entire prophecy, the one her father has spent centuries chasing, the one her mother sacrificed everything to prevent, was never actually written by anyone connected to her own family at all. It was written by a bitter, betrayed snow elf, nursing a grudge against his own god, patiently waiting across centuries for someone exactly like her to walk through his door. The fight that follows is chaotic and dangerous. Waves of reanimated Farmer and frozen Chorus unleashed in sequence, sections of the chapel ceiling collapsing under Werther's own magic as he grows increasingly desperate, and finally an ancient Frost Atronach summoned as his last line of defense once his other resources are exhausted. When he finally falls, his last words carry a strange, almost pitiable weight, an apology directed toward the very god who abandoned him centuries earlier. A final acknowledgement that whatever path he chose, however much destruction it caused along the way, was born out of genuine pain rather than pure malice. Gelliber arrives moments after the battle ends, and the truth of what actually happened to his brother lands with visible devastation. He had spent centuries believing Werther was a victim, corrupted against his will by the farmer who overran the chantry, only to learn that the real story was infinitely sadder. A brother who chose vampirism and vengeance over faith, and who used that transformation to engineer a scheme that could have ended the sun itself. True to his word despite the grief clearly written across his reaction, Gelliber grants Auriel's bow as promised, along with an offer to bless ordinary arrows into something called sun-hallowed elven arrows, weapons imbued with the power of the very sun the bow was originally built to honor. And in a final, quietly loaded gesture, Serana offers her own blood to corrupt a separate set of arrows into something called blood-cursed elven arrows, a choice that lets her, on her own terms and by her own decision this time, be the one who decides exactly how her uniquely potent blood gets used, rather than having that choice made for her by anyone else. It's a small moment, easy to miss amid the drama of everything else happening around it, but it represents something genuinely significant in her character's arc. For the first time in this entire story, her blood is being used because she chose to offer it, not because a father demanded it or a mother felt compelled to hide it away. Auriel's bow itself carries a weight of history that stretches back far beyond anything happening in this particular story, tied according to certain ancient accounts to the very moment Trinimac struck down Lorcan and fastened his torn-out heart to an arrow, loosing it out over the sea in an act that some traditions credit with the eventual formation of Red Mountain far away in Morrowind. Whether or not every detail of that older myth is meant to be taken literally, the bow's reputation as an artifact tied directly to the power of the sun itself, wielded traditionally by the Chantry of Auriel, here in this same secluded Vale, for as long as anyone could remember, makes its corruption at Werther's hands feel like more than just a plot device. It's a genuine sacrilege, a weapon built to channel divine light being twisted, however temporarily and however narrowly averted, into something capable of extinguishing that same light entirely. Understanding that weight makes Serana's choice to hand over her own blood willingly, rather than have it taken from her, land with even more significance than it might otherwise carry. The last of the Volkihar. With Auriel's bow finally in hand, there's nothing left standing between this story and its ending, except Harkon himself. Serana, having spent this entire journey uncovering exactly how far her father is willing to go, and exactly how little regard he holds for anyone standing in his path, including his own family, comes to a conclusion that clearly costs her something even as she voices it, with resolve. He has to be stopped permanently, and the only path left that accomplishes that is one that ends with his death. This isn't framed as an easy decision for her, and it shouldn't be. Whatever Harkon became, whatever monstrous ambitions consumed him, across the centuries since his own transformation, he was still her father, and choosing to actively participate in his death is not a small thing for her to carry, regardless of how thoroughly he's earned it through his own actions. The final assault on Castle Volkihar unfolds differently depending on which side of this conflict the Dragonborn has chosen to stand on, though the destination remains identical either way. For those who sided with the Dawnguard, Isran gathers every fighter under his command for one final decisive push, delivering a rallying speech about finally answering years of vampire predation with real, organized force, before leading Serene Gerard, Kalan, Agmer, Durag, Gunmar, and an armored troll on the long march toward the island fortress. Reaching the castle means fighting through waves of vampires and gargoyles defending the outdoor approach, before pressing further inside to clear the remaining defenders in a chaotic, sprawling battle that spills through hallways and feasting rooms alike. For those who instead chose to side with the Volkihar clan, the approach looks entirely different. A quiet walk through halls that remain deceptively calm. Vampires who once might have looked at you with suspicion now treating you as a fellow member of the court, unaware that you're walking through their home for the last time before everything changes forever. Either path eventually converges at the same place, the Volkihar Cathedral, where Harkon waits in his true vampire lord form, a shape far more monstrous and imposing than the version of vampirism most players will have encountered up to this point. The conversation that follows carries a different tone depending on your allegiance. Harkon's contempt for a disloyal Dawnguard ally shifting into something closer to bitter, almost resigned acknowledgement if you approach him instead as someone who once accepted his gift and is now turning against him anyway. But regardless of which version of that conversation unfolds, the outcome is identical. Harkon demands Oriel's bow, and there is no version of this exchange where handing it over ends peacefully. Whether you refuse outright or attempt to comply, he attacks either way, revealing that whatever thin diplomatic pretense existed in this final meeting was never anything more than a formality before inevitable violence. Before the confrontation with Harkon himself, the fighting throughout the rest of the castle carries its own weight, particularly for anyone who has spent enough time wandering these halls to recognize the vampires now standing against them. Figures like Vingalmo and Orthiolf, whose quiet rivalry for Harkon's favor had simmered for who knows how many centuries in the background of this entire story, meet their end here alongside the rest of the court, their long and patient ambitions extinguished in a single chaotic night that none of their careful positioning ever prepared them for. There is a strange finality to watching an entire vampiric court, built up over centuries of careful hierarchy and quiet scheming, collapse within the span of a single evening. Proof that no amount of immortal patience can fully insulate anyone from the consequences of the choices made by the person sitting at the top of that hierarchy. The battle against Harkon is genuinely difficult, a fight that demands every resource accumulated across the entire questline. He teleports unpredictably across the cathedral, strikes with devastating claws and shock-based attacks, and summons his own reinforcements to complicate an already chaotic fight. When his health drops low enough, he retreats to an altar and wraps himself in a swirling sphere of red energy, attempting to heal the damage already dealt, a moment that specifically calls for sun-hallowed arrows fired from Oriel's bow itself. the sun's own power interrupting whatever dark magic he's attempting to use to cheat his own death. When he finally falls for good, his body doesn't leave behind a corpse in any conventional sense. It collapses into ash, the same fate that eventually claims every vampire regardless of how ancient or powerful they once were. A final and almost anticlimactic end for a man who spent centuries and sacrificed 1,000 innocent lives specifically to avoid exactly this outcome. What follows immediately afterward is, in its own quiet way, just as important as the battle itself. Serana's reaction to her father's death isn't triumphant, and the game is careful never to let it feel like a simple, uncomplicated victory. Speaking with whoever leads the aftermath, whether that's Isran commending the Dawn Guard's success, or Garan Morethi acknowledging a new master among the Volkihar court, Serana's own words cut through whatever celebration might otherwise be happening around her. She acknowledges plainly that Harkon was out of control, that what happened had to be done, and that she isn't happy about it despite that certainty. He was still her father, she says. Even after everything, even after centuries of watching him prioritize an increasingly monstrous ambition over every relationship he once had, including the one with her. And then comes the line that arguably captures the entire emotional truth of this whole story better than anything else in it. Her quiet observation that her real father, the version of him she might have actually recognized and loved without complication, died a very long time before this final confrontation ever took place. What happened in that cathedral wasn't really the death of her father at all. It was just the ending of something else, something that had already been dead and hollow for centuries, wearing her father's shape without any of the substance that once made him someone worth loving unconditionally. There's a particular kind of grief that comes from losing someone you had already, in every practical sense, lost long before their actual death, and Serana's reaction in this final moment captures that specific and difficult emotion better than almost anything else in this entire story. She isn't mourning the tyrant who chased a prophecy across centuries at the cost of everyone who loved him. She is mourning, quietly and privately, the father he might have been before ambition and immortality hollowed him out into something else entirely, a person she can barely remember clearly anymore, buried somewhere beneath layers of obsession that calcified over the span of 1,000 years. That kind of grief doesn't resolve neatly just because the threat has been eliminated. It lingers, complicated and contradictory, refusing to fit into the simple categories of triumph or relief that a story like this might otherwise be tempted to offer. In the aftermath, Valerica, informed of her husband's death, is finally able to leave the Soul Cairn behind after everything that trapped her there for so long, returning at last to Castle Volkihar and taking up residence in her old study, where repairs slowly begin transforming the ruined portions of the castle back into something livable. Serana herself settles for a time, whether at Fort Dawnguard or within Volkihar Keep, depending on the path chosen, though she makes clear that she has no intention of remaining stationary forever. She expresses, in her own understated way, a genuine desire to keep exploring the world alongside the Dragonborn, an entire era's worth of curiosity, finally free to actually be satisfied after so long spent locked away from the ability to pursue it. And that curiosity, once you've spent enough time traveling beside her, never really seems performative. She'll comment on ordinary weather with genuine delight, remark on unfamiliar Nordic ruins with the specific fascination of someone cataloguing a world she's only now getting the chance to properly experience firsthand rather than through borrowed pages from a childhood library, and continue reanimating fallen enemies in battle with the same practiced, matter-of-fact necromancy her mother once taught her in a garden that no longer exists in any form she'd recognize. She carries her past with her everywhere she goes, not as a burden she's trying to escape, but simply as the accumulated weight of having lived, however unevenly and however interrupted, for longer than almost anyone else she will ever meet. Whether she ever ultimately seeks out a cure for her own vampirism, shedding the power that has defined and complicated her entire existence since that ceremony centuries ago, remains genuinely unresolved, left to the choices made by whoever is telling this particular version of her story. There is also the small, unresolved matter of Serana's own cure, a question the game leaves entirely in the hands of whoever is living through this story with her. She has, at various points, expressed a wish to simply live her life again, to shed the vampirism that has defined every single relationship in her life and every conflict that grew out of those relationships. And yet, she has also made clear, in the way she speaks about the power itself, that she never fully regretted what the transformation granted her, only what it cost the people she loved. Choosing to seek a cure should that path ever be taken would mean losing her enhanced senses, her resistance to frost, her ability to reanimate the dead in battle, and the particular strength that let her survive dangers that would have killed an ordinary mortal outright. Choosing to remain as she is means carrying forward a condition inseparable from everything that broke her family apart in the first place. Neither choice erases the centuries that led her here, and the game, wisely, never pretends that either option would offer some tidy, complete resolution to a life shaped by so much loss. The lasting legacy of this entire conflict extends beyond the moment Harkon's ashes settle across the cathedral floor, since Oriel's bow itself remains a permanent fixture in the world going forward, capable of turning the sun red once per day through the use of blood-cursed elven arrows, temporarily suppressing the very weakness that drove Harkon to such extremes in the first place, without ever granting the full, permanent darkness his original prophecy demanded. It is a fitting middle ground for a story that never fully resolves into simple victory or simple loss, a partial and temporary echo of what Harkon wanted, achievable now only through deliberate, repeated choice, rather than one final catastrophic ritual. Should Serana ever choose to seek an actual cure for her vampirism, the path leads to a necromancer named Phalion, who resides in the town of Morthal, not far at all from the same mountains where this whole story first began inside Dim Hollow Crypt. That such a cure exists at all, openly available to anyone with the will to pursue it, stands as a final, almost bitter irony given everything Harkon sacrificed across the centuries, specifically to avoid the very mortality that a simple ritual could apparently have restored to any one of his family at any point, had any of them ever actually wanted it back.